So today I'm going to talk about three books by different authors trying to illustrate the point of minimalism as an approach to try and establish and achieve literary realism. So the first of those is If Nobody Speaks of Remarkable Things by Jon McGregor, a British author and a very highly touted British author who's garnered lots of prizes in quite a sort of young career. I think he was the youngest ever longlist nominee for the Booker at age 26 for this book. Basically, it's the story of a road in a northern city, a street I should say, and all the people who live on it. So it's lots of different voices, and it's very, very much about the ordinariness of the life of these people. Hence the title, If Nobody Speaks of Remarkable Things. I think the point being that the event at the end, to which the whole book has been building up, becomes far more remarkable, only if you're able to establish the ordinary stuff as significant in and of itself. You know, we tend to sort of dismiss them or overlook them, especially in literature, as not really being that interesting to write about. I think McGregor's trying to say, no, actually, the everyday is remarkable in its own way. But for me, it doesn't work. So jumping ahead to the ending, without spoiling the ending, the event at the end, to which it's been building up, which I think is supposed to be far more remarkable by being set in contrast with what's gone before, to me isn't that remarkable. It's only remarkable to the person that it happens to. All the people in the street are sort of, none of them have names. They're all referred to through a third person perspective, except one, which is a pregnant woman who is also the only one who seems to be able to sort of move in and out of time in the book, in that everyone in the street is on one particular day, but her story interweaves around that. So I think in the same way as pregnancy and childbirth and having children is a very normal, unremarkable thing, except for the person or the people it's happening to. If you have your child and you have this newborn baby, that is incredibly remarkable. But in the grand scheme of life and of sort of human existence, it's not remarkable at all. I mean, you know, it's what we've been doing ever since our creation. So this book doesn't work for me. He goes to very great lengths to give the characters in the street different voices that, you know, describe differently. But because the overall effect that he's after achieving is this sort of unremarkableness, this ordinariness, that those voices still blend into one another, because the tone for each and every one of them is the same, what he's aspiring to, which is a sort of, you know, quite a flat, level tone, unremarkable. And I'm afraid for me that makes this an unremarkable book. In a way, I sort of would categorise it as it's the literary equivalent of an L.S. Lowry painting, the guy who painted sort of matchstick figures. No detail, no personalisation, but a sort of a crowd scene or a group scene. And the painting sort of had value for, you know, giving a taste and a sort of a flavour of the whole, but there was no individual detail. And although obviously McGregor supplies the street characters with defining characteristics, ultimately there is no real detail about them. So that's his approach to minimalism in this. Now we come to a French author called Nathalie Sarraute, writing mainly in the sort of 60s and 70s and I think the 80s, who also took a minimalist approach. But what raises her approach of minimalism above, say, McGregor's is the language. She's doing quite extraordinary things with language. Where McGregor wanted to paint a sort of a group picture of a community, Sarraute goes the other way, at least in many of the stories here, where she's diving into a relationship between two people and just opens it up with extraordinary sort of forensic detail. So, for example, there's a couple of stories in here of just two people sat down at a table talking to each other. In one of them, a third person joins and puts the nose out of one of the people already there because he only wants to talk to the other person, now this third person. So the whole chemistry and the dynamics of the conversation has changed, and it's very much about sort of the guy who's got his nose put out of joint, sort of, you know, sitting there steaming and talking about, you know, how he can see in front of his very eyes, you know, that he's sort of losing power in the sense of he's not got a one-to-one relationship with the other speaker. Excuse me. The other story about sort of two people talking is again this sort of she explodes the situation. It's a very ordinary, everyday situation. Two people sat having a coffee and talking, but what she does is she breaks open the dynamics of that in a real sort of quite a blossoming way, so that she doesn't write dialogue. She's reporting on snippets of the dialogue. So, for example, he's addressing the other then with words designed to convey an idea or a chain of reasoning. He waits for them to reach their target and then examines the ones the other sends him in response. So what she's looking at is basically how communication works and doesn't work. There's a lot of description of angles, projection, you know, sort of, is your head tilted while you're addressing the other person, or is your head down sort of to receive? So it's very geometrical sort of analysis of communication, because communication isn't just about words, of course. It's gesture, which I'm doing now. It's facial expression. It's tone, which is the very first thing in that story that she states, is it's sort of establishing the tone that's used. And it's, so from a very, very tiny thing of a conversation, which we're not even privy to particularly because she doesn't reproduce the conversation, but she sort of expands all this, you know, what's going on at the same time and what's steering the conversation, and all the signs and signals that we may not be conscious of, but, you know, that inflects the communication that we make. So this is, I think, a much more interesting approach to minimalism, because the language isn't minimalistic, and the forensic detail that she applies to very small scenes, I think, is so much more expansive than what McGregor offered. And then the third one is Alain Robbe-Grillet, who, like Seurrat, was included in a sort of movement in 60s France, which is called the Nouveau Roman, or the New Novel, which was sort of quite a wide umbrella, really, of trying to write novels in a new way, which to my mind wasn't particularly new, but brought in a lot of elements that had already been tried by a lot of the literary modernists, but they were looking to get away from sort of, you know, plot and sort of all the standard elements of a novel, and they really were trying, particularly Robbe-Grillet, were particularly trying to sort of drive deep inside the human psyche, you know, the complexity of human thought and emotion. But the interesting thing about Robbe-Grillet is he does it not as a sort of psychoanalytical approach in terms of someone expounding about themselves and, you know, all their emotions coming out. He does it in a much more interesting and intriguing way, whereby the reader has to sort of tease out the emotions of the characters and all, but what the character, you know, the characters aren't doing anything. In this book, jealousy, which in French is la jalousie, that word has two meanings. One, jealousy, as in English, but the other is it's the slats of shutters or blinds, because there's the storyline, while never sort of specified, seems to be one of voyeurism, and it seems to be voyeurism by a husband on his wife and a friend called Frank, who's the only character who gets named. So it's something all of these shares, they don't name their characters. So basically, this guy, the guy we think is sort of looking in through the shutters, is spying on his wife and his friend Frank, and he basically we assume is trying to see if they're having an affair. At no point in the book are they doing anything but sitting and talking. But what's really interesting, and this is where you tease out the psychological state of the husband, is Robbe-Grillet is only talking about time, objects, and transitions. So, is there I can't remember now if there's actually a map. If Robbe-Grillet provides a map. Yes. So he provides the layout where all the action, such as it is, takes place. And this is crucial because basically there's about 8 or 10 landmarks within the house, and it's sort of the veranda and places like that. And all Robbe-Grillet does is he keeps returning over and over to sort of, go over this map and the tiny changes that happen. So, for example, one of the landmarks is a centipede has been crushed against the wall and left a mark, sort of a bit like my one there. And, of course, that never moves or changes, except the movement of the sun, the movement of the light through the house changes how that mark looks. Sometimes it's in shadow, sometimes it's, full focus of the light. So at the dinner table, how many places are set for dinner? We know there's only 2 characters in there, plus maybe the husband outside. So the significance of changing numbers of place settings for dinner, or the number of chairs out on the veranda. These are all, that's all he describes. That's all he's offering is objects, things. But from that, we sort of ascertain the view of the voyeur of the husband figure that we think is the husband, how he's reacting to the sort of subtle transitions and changes, and what that signifies to him. Is that enough proof to him that his wife's having an affair? And it's inspired, really. It is a very different type of novel because it's all about sort of inner psychology, but purely revealed by objects, material things that have no consciousness. So we, the reader, like the husband, are imparting meaning and significance to these objects and how they subtly move or don't move. And I think it's an extraordinary piece of work. It's a piece of work that can leave a reader who sort of doesn't get into it as, this is dull, nothing's happening, and on one level they're right. But if you're prepared to go with Robbe-Grillet and enter the world that he's creating, I think it's fascinating. And the role of time is really, really important because there's no movement by the humans, or minimal movement by the humans, and there's no action, no events. But time is moving inexorably on, and little markers of time, such as the movement of light, such as it's dinner time. Oh, how many place settings are there, and all that sort of stuff. So, although these two were sort of couched under the same movement, I think they take very different approaches. Because for Robbe-Grillet, it's the entirety of the house and all its, I say they're landmarks. I mean, obviously landmarks tend to be in bigger spaces in the house, but I can't think of a better word. So it's about the entirety and subtle changes, small shifts in them. So that's his minimalism. Whereas for Sarraute, it's all about the moments. He has no moments really, and if there are moments, they're tiny, tiny variations in where objects are. She takes a moment, and just expands and explodes it really, and just sort of really goes to work on it. So I think, even though they're part of the same movement, they have very different approaches, and yet they are both minimalist. He's minimalist in the sense of he doesn't give you anything. He's talking about objects. There's no human, barely any human action except as it's reproduced in the objects. The chair on the veranda is set out, or the drink is drunk, that kind of thing. So it's like the human agents, the result of human agency. Whereas she is about, the dynamism, all the tiny bits of things that go into a simple conversation, and it is like a sort of her writing is, she opens up a tiny incident like a flower. So 2 very different approaches to minimalism, and both different to him. I think what these 2 achieve, and that McGregor fails to, McGregor is approaching realism at small scale, and he's sort of just treating it head on. He's just trying to reproduce it like a camera tries to reproduce an image. Whereas these 2, there's added value in their minimalism, because yes, they're talking about their route to realism is through the structure of what they're doing, whereas I think he just reproduces a straight sort of translation of, I look out my window and that's what I see in my street or whatever. But these 2 the very narrative structure just opens up what they're doing so much more. So his minimalism, in which there's very little human agency, and yet is the key to unlocking human agency. What is going on in that husband's mind? So it's never described as if someone's just observing it. You know, this is what he says, this is what he does. None of that's in there. It's about, we have to dig inside with him by observing the movement or non-movement of objects around his house. And I think her thing is just the use of language and the use of analysis. You know, she writes stories that are sort of quite analytical in a way. You know, here's a snippet of dialogue. You know, there's a story here called Your Father, Your Sister. And the whole story revolves around a line overheard in a restaurant or a cafe where on the table next to them, a mother tells her son or her daughter, if you don't stop doing that, your dad will prefer your brother. And from that point on, Seurrat and the character of the story, she just goes, what does that mean? You know, brother, sister, father. And she sort of just breaks it down, all the possible implications. You know, it's a terrible thing to say to a child anyway. But she deconstructs it. And, you know, this isn't something she said. This isn't her conversation or the character in the book's conversation. It's an overheard conversation. So she's projecting the whole thing just by thinking about the words. And it's an extraordinary blossoming. That's what I'm saying. You know, she's a blossoming. He's a sort of, you've got to really mine and dig deep and put in a lot of work. And for me, unfortunately, McGregor is just, it's like, you know, observational comedy. You know, it's like, I look out my window and this is what I see. So 3 very different approaches with, I think, 3 quite different outcomes. 2 intriguing. Are they successful? I don't know. I think that's a sort of personal taste of the reader. But one for me that doesn't. You know, for all the sort of plaudits that McGregor has received. And his follow-up book was called something like Even the Dogs, which I read and enjoyed even less than this one. That story was basically a guy dies in his house, and he's thrown his house, before he dies, he's thrown his house open to all the sort of wastrels and drug addicts and drunks, you know, to come. They can hang out that house, they can drink, they can do drugs and stuff. He's sort of thrown it open to them. And, you know, he's died, and so are they all going to, you know, what's going to happen to the house? You know, they're all going to have to move on and all this kind of stuff. And again, he works very hard at creating different voices, using different stylistic things on the page to create these different voices, all these different sort of, you know, drug-addled people. There's a war vet, you know, and drunks and things, runaways, all that kind of stuff. So on one level, they are very distinguished one from another. Again, even though they're not named, they sort of have a distinct voice. But again, ultimately, they're all the same. Because they're all these sort of, you know, people who've gone there to do the same thing, which is take advantage of a free space to do illegal or destructive activities. And they all think the same, and they're all basically addicted. And ultimately, there's no colour to differentiate them. You know, they all end up following the same sort of thinking and rules or non-rules, and it just doesn't work. He's got a new book coming out in 2017, and I'm really in 2 minds whether I'm going to read it. If it's different, if it's really stylistically different, even to the point of abandoning a sort of depersonalised minimalist take, I would read it. If I get a sort of scent that it's, you know, in the mould of this and the follow-up, I can't bring myself to read it, because for me, minimalism on its own as an exercise, no matter how poetic, and unfortunately I don't think he is that poetic because he's talking about the humdrum and the mundane, you've got to, you know, the minimalism has to lead to something greater. That's the key. And these 2, I think potentially it does, although you may not agree, and therefore it might not work for you in the way this didn't work for me. But I can't see what's greater than, you know, what an exercise in minimalism leading to a great. I can't see anything in McGregor from that. So there, I'm going to leave that on minimalism. 3 or two sort of related authors in the sense they were both categorised under the same movement, and a third author who probably would normally not be mentioned in the same breath. I don't mean in terms of quality, I just mean in terms of style or what they're trying to achieve. But three minimalist authors. Does that bring us any closer to realism? Well, Sarraute, it's a curious tension in Seurrat because the things she's analysing are very normal, down-to-earth realism, but the language isn't. And I think what Robbe-Grillet was trying to do was to try and get a psychological realism through temporal and spatial relationships. It's a brave strategy. Okay, that's it for this week. Thanks.